Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode lucky number 13 of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the great and try to get past the honorific to understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I am grateful that you are here. From time to time, you indulge me in asking for your help spreading the word about this podcast. Your recommendation means so much, so if you're up for it, I sure would be grateful if you could mention it to friends and family or share it through whatever means possible. Thank you. When we last left off, the Macedonian royal family, minus Queen Olympias, who was sulking in self-imposed exile in her home kingdom of Epirus, gathered for a hard-drinking wedding celebration at the capital city of Pella. Philip II was marrying off his and Olympias' daughter, Cleopatra, to her uncle, who was Olympias' brother, King Alexander I of Epirus. If you're wondering how the young Alexander the Great is Alexander III and his older uncle is Alexander I, just remember that though they have the same name, they're from different kingdoms, so each kingdom has a different king list. Okay, confession time. Maybe it's the name, or maybe it's because I think he tends to get overlooked on account of his son, but I really like Philip II. He was a hard guy, for sure. He could be tough on the people around him, and like any good king from the ancient world, he could level a city or two. But he was unusually reliant on diplomacy, a brilliant military innovator, and generally didn't hold a deep grudge, even against people like the Order Demosthenes, who spent so much time trashing the Macedonian king. Philip II was hardly the uncouth barbarian he was made out to be by his petty Greek cousins. He loved music and the arts, he engaged in thoughtful debates with courtly retainers, he invited learned scholars and thinkers to join his court and to enrich the spiritual and intellectual discussions there. He cultivated his own mind in addition to doing the same for those around him. For example, in addition to hiring Aristotle to tutor his son Alexander, Philip invited Speusippus, a nephew of Plato, to come to Pella to just sit around and join the local intelligentsia. That way, the philosopher could help enrich the lives, the intellects, the moral fiber of the Macedonian nobility. Philip sharpened the iron of his mind as much as he did that of his sword. Yes, I like Philip. In fact, I like him so much that I ended the last episode where I did, just to be sure that he had one more fun evening, because, you see, Philip isn't going to be around much longer. On the morning of the big day, the omens were taken as per custom. The diviner declared that the omens were auspicious. Today would be a good day. In a celebratory mood, Philip dispensed with his usual retainers and close corps of 7 hand-picked elite bodyguards. Allegedly, this was to make the king seem approachable to the Greek diplomats in attendance at the wedding festivities. Philip was always careful to assuage Greek concerns that he was a tyrant. And there's something sad that he was so worried about how he would be seen that he allowed himself to be killed. On the fateful day, in October 336 BCE, one of these bodyguards, Pausanias of Orestis, rushed the unguarded king and fatally stabbed him between the ribs. Pausanias ran to make his getaway, running for a horse that he had ready for the big escape. Some sources say that Pausanias' sandal got caught. Others say that he tripped on a vine. Still others say that he made it to his horse, but his horse tripped on a vine. All agree that the assassin fell to the ground and was immediately stabbed to death by imperial retainers. All this happened while the king bled out from his wound. He had led a remarkable life and career. He had survived countless battles, leading his men and their long spears into fight after fight, sometimes injured, but always left standing. He had seen so much warfare, so much campaigning, and in the end it was one of his own bodyguards that betrayed him, and at a wedding of all places. Why? What could have motivated Pausanias to kill his king? So here, the stories get weird. The only contemporary account of the assassination came from Aristotle, who should be probably a pretty trusty source. He simply said that Pausanias was getting revenge for an insult that he had suffered at the hands of Philip's uncle-in-law, Attalus. This Attalus, by the way, was the same guy that made the comment about Philip siring a full-blooded Macedonian heir that triggered the exile of Alexander and Olympias mentioned in the last episode. You may also recall that Attalus was over in Persian territory, leading the early stages of the Macedonian-Greek coalition forces in their invasion of Persia. Aristotle doesn't embellish. He just says that Pausanias was insulted and he did it because he wanted to avenge the insult. Now, this is where the weird stuff starts to come in. Over the years, decades, and even centuries, all sorts of stories began to emerge about what motivated Pausanias. In one story, Pausanias was a lover of Philip, who, in addition to his many wives, also had numerous male and female sexual partners. In this story, Philip began to prefer a younger man, also named, strangely enough, Pausanias. The elder Pausanias thus killed Philip in a fit of jealousy. The next level weird version is that Attalus had been taunting and abusing Pausanias, who sought relief from the king. When none came, Pausanias murdered Philip for failing to defend his honor. Another version takes the story to a further extreme. In this version, the older Pausanias publicly upbraided the younger Pausanias for luring Philip away. Humiliated by this treatment, the younger man threw himself into a battle with the dreaded Illyrians, but rather than fight, he took the full brunt of their swords and arrows, essentially choosing to die in battle to restore his honor. Attalus took exception to the behavior of the elder Pausanias, and the two got into an argument. Attalus then forced Pausanias to drink, and when the bodyguard was good and drunk, Attalus raped him. Then, to further humiliate Pausanias, Attalus turned over the drunken and highly vulnerable Pausanias to a group of imperial muleteers. They each took turns raping the poor guy. When he sobered up and went to Philip, Pausanias begged for Attalus to be punished. Philip expressed sympathy but took no action. Attalus was a brilliant general. The two were bound by marriage, and he had a key role to play in the campaign to conquer Persia. Philip needed Attalus, so he declined to punish him. So Pausanias put a knife in the king's abdomen. In the final and most salacious version, Pausanias was acting on the instigation and direction of Alexander and Olympias. The queen and prince, worried that their grip on the succession was slipping away, orchestrated the assassination in order to make sure that nothing got in the way of Alexander's ascent to the throne. After all, Olympias was still in exile, and Philip hadn't defended his son's right to inherit the kingdom when Attalus had made his impolitic comment about Philip siring a full-blooded Macedonian heir. In this version of events, Pausanias had complained of his ill treatment at the hands of Attalus. When Philip declined to chasten his general and fellow Macedonian, word made it to Alexander and Olympias. The scheming pair used his disaffection to goad the scorned bodyguard into murdering the king, making him an unwitting instrument of the queen and prince's boundless ambition. So, is there any truth to this story? Did Alexander have a hand in his father's murder? The truth is lost to time, but this scenario seems, to me at least, extremely unlikely. At this time, the idea of someone else taking over the kingdom was purely hypothetical. Sure, Olympias was mad that Attalus had made a drunken comment about a pure-blood Macedonian one day inheriting the throne, but her manner of coping was to flee the country. Coordinating an assassination plot from a couple hundred miles away is implausible. If she had vowed to murder her husband, she would have been much better able to control events up close and personal. It wasn't like there were dozens of talented and ambitious half-brothers just waiting in the wings. There was no real threat to Alexander in terms of age or resume. By the time that Philip was assassinated, Alexander had already gotten his own military career off to a smashing start. At 16, he'd personally organized and led an expedition to crush the pretensions of some troublesome tribes, and followed that up by serving brilliantly in Philip's campaigns at the head of his cavalry. Alexander had won the trust and loyalty of the army, easily the most important factor in any succession consideration. But had the army gotten wind that Alexander was behind the murder of their king, then they would not have been as fiercely loyal as they would prove to be in all the events that followed. They may have even revolted. They liked Alexander, but they loved Philip. Petty family drama notwithstanding, Alexander was clearly on the rise. There was no need to kill Philip to eliminate a threat to Alexander's eventual rule, because there was no real threat to Alexander's eventual rule. Besides, Philip had singled Alexander out for a special education, picking Aristotle to help groom the boy for power and surrounding him with the cream of the Macedonian nobility to serve as his classmates and companions. He was meant to rule. He was groomed to rule. And he would, in time. He was just 20. Impatient and ambitious though he may have been, he was young enough that killing his dad to take over would have been premature, especially given that he was a relatively older 46 years of age. It just doesn't strike me as plausible. But what about Olympias? Alexander had taken steps to mend fences with his dad, but the queen had remained in exile in Epirus. Maybe she had engineered Philip's killing without Alexander's knowledge, both to vault him to the top and to clear all the obstacles in front of her. Again, I struggle to see this as likely. What true motivation did she have? Her son was on the way to the top, and, if found out, she stood to lose a lot more than she gained. Olympias is often treated roughly in the ancient sources. Why is it okay for a guy to be ambitious to the point of slaughtering tens of thousands of enemies and get labeled as great for good measure, but not okay for a queen to want her son to be king? I think we can shrug off the accusations lobbed at Olympias as being rooted in the ancient historian's propensity towards misogyny. Another intriguing theory is that it was the Persians who had orchestrated the killing. You will recall that the opening phases of the war with Persia were underway. and things were going well for the Macedonians, so far. In this line of reasoning, rather than fight a series of battles, the Persians just iced Philip, dusted off their hands, and congratulated themselves on a clever and quick solution to their problem. In the years to come, Alexander himself would publicly back this story, even going so far as to claim that the Persian king of kings, Darius III, personally confessed to this treachery. This also seems like nonsense, a retrospective justification for the events that followed. For what it's worth, this is far from an exhaustive list of all of the theories over who killed Philip and why. There are plenty more besides these, and all sorts of different spins on the ones we've already discussed. It makes sense in a way. The death of Philip II was an epochal event. In life, he shaped the world around him. His death shook the most powerful kingdom in the Greek world to its very core. You might ask, why spend all this time exploring all the different versions of the events that left Philip dead? I think the assassination is a great example of how the mythologizing of the past happens. We start with a simple story. One guy got mad and killed another. Then, a group of people who had no connection to the events, and even lived hundreds of years later, started embellishing, mythologizing, and quite probably fabricating. But because so many sources are lost to the fog of time, and because these highly questionable sources just happen to be ancient too, we tend to give them credence. Remember, just because a source is 2 millennia old doesn't mean it's reliable. In our case, a 2,000-year-old source is still more than 3 centuries removed from the events it depicts. If I wrote today with seeming certainty about what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke, would you pay it any mind? Probably not, and rightfully so. At the same time, there might not be anything better to draw on. Or we don't know which story to believe. Oh God, I'm rambling. Maybe I'm just holding on to Philip for as long as I can. Okay, one last thing on Philip II before we bury him for good. This is kind of neat. By the time of Philip and Alexander, the Macedonian capital was the city of Pella. But their ancestors built and embellished a predecessor capital, Aegae, in the modern town of Vergina. The city was lovely and home to some of the largest monumental buildings in all of classical Greece. In 1977, Greek archaeologists digging in the modern town of Vergina discovered a series of unlooted tombs. Among these tombs were those belonging to Philip's mother, Eurydice, and one belonging to the great king himself. When he was finally interred, Philip II enjoyed more than 2 millennia of uninterrupted rest. The inveterate traveling warrior sure had earned it. Among other grave goods, the tomb contained precious gold and silver artifacts, and finely crafted ceremonial weapons and armor. Inside the tomb was a stone sarcophagus, which, when opened, revealed a gold ossuary with the bones of a man carefully wrapped in purple textile. Today, the tomb is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and for those that care to, they can pay their respects to the Macedonian king. Okay, Philip is dead. Now what? Well, we've talked a lot about what other people thought about the assassination. The only thing that really mattered was, what did Alexander think? For one, he wanted no question about who would succeed to the throne. You may recall that Philip had sent some of his senior generals, notably Attalus, and another guy named Parmenio, who would be a very important character for Alexander, ahead to start the war in Asia. With his colleagues out of town, this left Antipater, one of Philip's senior generals and retainers, as the ranking member of Philip's court present in Macedonia for these dramatic events. To expedite the succession, Antipater brought Alexander before the officer corps and soldiers. The troops proclaimed Alexander as their king. This both ensured a smooth transition and demonstrated Antipater's loyalty to the new regime. As we've seen time and again, succession, especially unexpected succession, was often a window for ambitious people to use in attempts to grab power for themselves. But there was no attempted usurpation. Antipater stood beside Alexander's side and promised to give the young kid every bit of loyalty and support that he had given the now dead one. It was a shrewd move for Antipater, and he would be richly rewarded. Alexander had learned a lot from his father. In trying to become a world-renowned conqueror, he could not have asked for a better mentor. But Alexander was born long after Philip had become king, so he had no memory of Philip's own accession and early administration. You may recall that Philip had come to the throne by brushing aside his nephew, Amyntas IV, son of his slain older brother, Perdiccas III. But Philip had let Amyntas live a quiet and untroubled life, even marrying one of his own daughters to the displaced royal heir. When Alexander took control, he could not allow such a rival, unassuming and unambitious though he may have been. After all, this was Macedonia, and the Argeads were always prone to shedding the blood of family in pursuit of power. Despite the quiet and unambitious life of the young prince, Alexander swiftly dispatched his poor relative, having him executed shortly after taking the throne. He also ordered the death of the diviner that had declared the positive omens on the fateful day. This unfortunate fellow was not suspected of any overt treachery. He was just bad at his job, apparently, and he had to pay the consequences. I wonder if he saw it coming. Alexander even had the horse Pausanias intended for his getaway killed. Alexander followed these acts up by having 2 more Macedonian nobles executed on the pretense that they were involved in Philip's death. This may or may not have been the case, but either way, Alexander was cleaning house. His mom did too. Olympias, mother of the new king, took advantage of the chaos to enact her own bloody purge. She was still resentful of Cleopatra Eurydice, the 7th and final wife of Philip II and niece of the obnoxious Attalus. Only having married Philip a year or 2 earlier, the young queen had an infant daughter, Europa. Venting her fury, Olympias had Cleopatra and her daughter seized and then burned at the stake. Political murders were nothing new in Macedonia, but the killing of Cleopatra and Europa represented the first time women and children fell victim. It would not be the last. Cleopatra Eurydice may have also had an infant son, Caranus. Given the short duration of her marriage to Philip before his death, it's also possible, even likely, that Caranus was the son of one of Philip's other wives. Regardless, the baby boy was likewise dispatched by Olympias with cold-hearted viciousness. Quite the charmer, that Olympias. It's said that Alexander was furious over the bloodletting. After all, these were his brothers and sisters. But what difference did that make? It's not like he could bring them back. It's likely in these post-succession killings that we find the idea that Olympias was responsible for Philip's death too. After all, if she killed a poor, innocent young bride and her infant daughter, and by burning at the stake no less, clearly she would have had no issue murdering her own much older husband. Again, this seems like a convenient retrofitting. Olympias, and maybe Alexander, were using the aftermath of the assassination to set their own house in order. But the mother-son duo had a big, big question to consider. What to do with Attalus? He was the guy who made the snide comment to Philip about fathering a true heir. That was what sent Olympias and Alexander into exile. He was also the guy that had, allegedly, abused Philip's killer, triggering the fateful events. But Attalus was one of Philip's most trusted generals and currently leading the early stages of the Persian campaign alongside that other guy, Parmenio. In addition to co-leading this vital military effort, the 2 generals were linked by marriage. Attalus was married to one of Parmenio's daughters. After Philip had died, and Olympias murdered Attalus' niece and her daughter, the general must have understood that his position was tenuous. After all, it was Philip that had protected and declined to chastise Attalus. Perhaps fearing for his own safety, Attalus began corresponding with Demosthenes, that Athenian blowhard that was always looking for ways to stick it to Philip and the Macedonians. It's not clear who initiated the correspondence. It's possible that Attalus wrote first. It's also possible, even likely, that all Attalus did was receive a letter from Demosthenes, who wrote to Attalus proposing that the 2 team up for rebellion against the new and untested king. Attalus weighed up his best course of action and decided to forward Demosthenes' letter to Alexander, along with a pledge of support and loyalty to the new king. Once the shocking correspondence was in hand, Alexander considered what to do with this turn of events. On one hand, Attalus had proven, or at least claimed, his loyalty to Alexander by sharing the correspondence with Demosthenes. On the other hand, Attalus had been talking to the guy in the first place. What to do? Alexander weighed up his options and dispatched one of his loyal retainers to Asia to bring back Attalus, dead or alive. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Attalus was duly murdered, and Parmenio, who did not intervene to save his colleague and son-in-law, grew in royal favor for standing by and letting the events unfold. As a thanks for his loyalty, Parmenio was placed in sole control of the Persian campaign. As for Alexander, the motivation to eliminate Attalus likely went beyond the new king's concerns over Demosthenes meddling in Macedonian politics. After all, Olympias had just murdered Attalus' niece, Cleopatra Eurydice, and her infant child or children. The older general would have had a reason to seek revenge. After all, Macedonian politics were nothing if not chaotic and blood-soaked. History would suggest that a violent reprisal from one Macedonian to another was, in the realm of possibilities. And besides, Attalus was with the cream of the Macedonian military, 10,000 strong and enjoying successes in the overthrow of the Persian control of the Ionian cities. He was popular at home and abroad. His fate was likely sealed the moment Olympias killed her rival Cleopatra. Maybe that's why Alexander was so mad at his mom for killing the young queen. His calculating, logical brain understood that her impudence cost him one of his very best generals. Demosthenes may have been denied a very useful co-conspirator, but he was not one to give up. For the time being, though, he had to keep his schemes to himself and to bide his time. Alexander was quick to show his Greek neighbors that Philip's death meant nothing. Granted, there was still a sizable force over in Persian territory getting the war started, but Alexander had considerable local forces at his disposal. After sidestepping a brief resistance to Macedonian rule, Alexander marched a formidable Macedonian army into Greece just to make sure that everyone knew the score. They did, or at least said they did. Once again, all the Greek cities, except Sparta, recognized Alexander's hegemony. While on this little jaunt, Alexander stopped by in the city of Corinth. All the town grandees showed up and waited in line to come kiss the ring. On and on, these sycophants blathered about what a great guy Alexander was, and how much they appreciated him, and how loyal they were. Alexander likely got bored with their over-the-top praise. He was, after all, more than smart enough to see through their saccharine puffery. They weren't fooling him, but he let them go through the motions of offering their supplication. In time, though, he noticed that one of the most famous residents of the city had not come to pay his respects. Intrigued, Alexander and his companions went off to find this guy, who had the nerve not to show up and pay homage to the overlord of all of Greece. Diogenes was somewhere in his mid-60s or 70s when the new Macedonian king arrived in Corinth. He had lived his own interesting life. Hailing from the city of Sinope, he had to flee when he was caught counterfeiting the city's currency. He then went to Athens, where he took up the role of gadfly, criticizing everyone and everything. Perhaps not surprisingly, this tended to get on people's nerves, but Diogenes got deeply embedded in the philosophical milieu of the city, and he began to share his own ideas, specifically his utter contempt for just about everyone and everything. Insulting people with his words and actions, including some provocative uses of all sorts of bodily fluids, Diogenes seemed to go out of his way to turn his nose to conventions of the day and to deliberately offend everyone. Imagine the Athenians' relief when Diogenes was kidnapped by pirates and sold into slavery. Eventually, though, he found his way to Corinth. He found his freedom and continued his ascetic ways. He developed a reputation as a great thinker, or an oddity, or both. He is considered as the founder of the philosophy of cynicism, which, among other things, suggests that people are only happy living free of the constraints of society and in harmony with nature. Cynicism translates roughly as doggish, and statues of Diogenes show him with a dog. It doesn't seem that he actually had a dog, but it does seem that he lived in a barrel. He was brilliant, but kind of nuts, or just deeply true to his philosophy. When Alexander tracked him down, he was quite taken with the crazy philosopher that had skipped out on the parade of sycophants bowing down before him. Approaching Diogenes, Alexander informed the thinker that he wanted to grant Diogenes whatever he wished. The reply came that if that were the case, then could Alexander move because he was blocking Diogenes' son? Alexander's companions found this uproarious. They burst into laughter. Given how touchy Alexander had been about the whole succession thing, what with the oops, I killed my brothers and sisters, it was hard to tell how he would react. No one talked to Alexander this way. Impressed with the gall of the older philosopher, the young king shook his head and laughed, stepping aside to leave Diogenes to his son. After all, Alexander had promised to grant Diogenes a wish, and Diogenes had, made a wish. Leaving the cynic to his sunbathing, Alexander commented to a friend that he'd rather be Diogenes than to be Alexander. While Alexander was on his tour down in Greece, some of those tribes in the pesky kingdoms of Thrace and Illyria began revolting. This was an annoyance to Alexander, but what's more, a strategic challenge. He had big plans for the next phase of the Persian campaign. Alexander needed these areas to be safe and secure before putting his plans into full effect. He rushed north out of mainland Greece and into the Balkans to crush the resistance. In hindsight, challenging Alexander was probably a terrible idea, but the kid was a brand new king, barely 20, and maybe testing his mettle seemed like a good idea at the time. Alexander hardly broke a sweat, smacking around the Thracians and the Illyrians. One battle in this early test of leadership is worth a quick examination. As Alexander prepared for battle, he looked up at the Thracians arrayed against him. Literally, the Thracians had the high ground. Charging an enemy uphill can be a dubious proposition, and this was the prospect facing Alexander. To make matters worse, the Thracians had a terrifying battlefield tactic that they frequently used to great effect. They would set fire to some of their baggage carts, then push them downhill, using the force of gravity to send the flaming carts crashing into enemy lines. This made the Thracians' possession of the high ground even more dire for the Macedonians. But Alex was not worried. Like his father, Alexander spent considerable time thinking through engagements and planning for the unexpected. He'd studied his enemy, he knew their tendencies, and he was prepared. He arrayed his troops in a very particular manner and gave them instructions to put in motion when the time came. As they lined up at the top of the hill, the Thracians smugly set fire to their carts and sent them careening down at the Macedonian troops. Rather than panic or duck for cover, Alexander calmly gave the signal that initiated the prearranged maneuver. On his command, his troops simply took a few steps left or right, collapsing into narrow columns and opening up big gaps in their lines. The Macedonians simply let the carts roll harmlessly through. And if a stray cart went off in an unpredictable direction and still bore down on some troops, Alexander was prepared for this too. He instructed his men to close ranks quickly, interlocking their shields and bracing one another. By combining the bronze of their shields and their body mass, the units became like giant boulders. The carts deflected off the men and bounced harmlessly away. Shocked by the ineffectiveness of their secret weapon, the disheartened Thracians were quickly overwhelmed by the energized Macedonians, who charged up the hill and flattened the Thracian rebellion. The Illyrians and Thracians learned their lessons quickly, but unfortunately there was one guy who could just never stop underestimating Macedonia, or maybe overestimating Athens, but definitely both. You guessed it, Demosthenes is back at it. While on campaign up in Thrace and Illyria, Alexander had received a minor wound in battle. Demosthenes decided to embellish and dragged a man to speak in front of a group of people and assembled politicos. The man, covered in blood for full effect, swore he saw Alexander dead, and Demosthenes whipped everyone up into a froth all about liberty and all that usual stuff. With Alexander dead, Demosthenes urged, now was the time to finally throw off the Macedonian yoke. He convinced the Athenians to backslide on its promise of support for and deference to Macedonia. He also roped in the Thebans into his conspiracy, and they joined in the revolt. Both cities took seed money from the Persian king Darius III to buy weapons and to fund the rebellion. Darius wanted the Hellenes out of his turf, and he figured that they were too busy fighting each other, then maybe they would have to leave his empire alone for a little while. Not a bad strategy. Persia, Athens, Thebes, they all made the classic mistake. Never underestimate a pissed-off Macedonian king. In 336 BCE, Alexander wrapped up his expedition to subdue Thrace and Illyria and marched back down into Greece. As he approached, Demosthenes ranted and raved about Alexander and Macedonia and the superiority of Athens. It was the same tired script he'd used to assail Philip, but Demosthenes' words could only go so far. When the chips were on the table and Athens was facing the full might of Alexander's army, the Athenians melted away, declining to commit their troops to battle. So too did all the other cities that had been shrieking about liberty. All shrewdly capitulated without a fight, hoping Alexander would be willing to shrug it off as a big misunderstanding. All that is, except Thebes, whose elders decided it was time to fight and overthrow Macedonian dominion. A few years earlier, after Philip had bested the Greek coalition at the Battle of Cannaria, he had stationed a garrison in Thebes to keep order and to make sure that they didn't get any ideas. Now, the Thebans chafed at this indignity. They made a play for their freedom. While the other Greek powers wilted away, the Thebans chose to fight. We can acknowledge their bravery even as we shake our heads at their stupidity. Alexander first attempted diplomacy. He kept his army at a distance and offered lenient terms of surrender. Just hand over the troublemakers and everything else will be fine. Rather than take this reasonable offer, the Thebans told Alexander to get lost. He waited a few days to give them a chance to change their minds. They didn't. They should have. When the two sides clashed in 335 BCE, it was, at first, a hard-fought affair. But the might of the Macedonian army was too much, and the Thebans were overwhelmed. Alexander's troop came crashing into the city, and all hell broke loose. Alexander let his troops savage the city and its residents. As so often happens, the sacking of a city led to all kinds of horrors. In one such incident, one of Alexander's officers raped a Theban noblewoman, and then demanded that she hand over any money or treasure that she had. The woman informed the officer that she kept her valuables safely stored at the bottom of her well. When the officer peered over the edge, she shoved him from behind and he fell to the bottom. She gathered up a few of her servants and a bunch of rocks, and together they stoned the officer to death at the bottom of the well. His comrades, enraged, seized the woman and dragged her before Alexander. He considered her actions and expressed admiration for her courage and her cunning. Not only was she set free, but Alexander ordered that she and her children be protected from any harassment or reprisals. The same could not be said for the rest of the city, however. All of the men were executed, the women and children sold into slavery, the civic buildings pulled down one by one. The only structures left standing were the temples, which Alexander left unmolested on a pretense of piety to the gods, and the ancient home of the poet Pindar. While the great poet had died nearly a century before, his home was a place of reverence, and Alexander always loved a good poem. The sack and destruction of Thebes is classic Alexander. On one hand, he and his troops absolutely obliterated the city and its residents. On the other, he performed these small acts of piety and leniency, expressing admiration for the vengeful noblewoman and sparing the city's temples and Pindar's house. He liked to find little examples of his enlightenment and benevolence while at the same time ordering or allowing savagery on a truly horrifying scale. In raising Thebes, his goal was not only to punish the city for its rebellion, but also to cow the rest of Greece. No one should ever get such ideas again, and for God's sake, stop listening to Demosthenes. In his obliteration of Thebes, Alexander had another motive. Sure, he wanted to remind everyone of the futility of standing up to Macedonia, but he was going to be out of town soon enough, and when he went away to carry out the long-awaited Persian campaign, he needed everyone to remember their place. Thracians, Illyrians, Greeks, it didn't matter. They all needed to remember that there were very serious consequences to those that would rebel. You come at the king, you best not miss. But what to do with Athens? Once again, Demosthenes and the anti-Macedonian faction had whipped everyone up into a frenzy, but then let others take the brunt of the consequences. Alexander marched to Athens and demanded that the rabble-rousers be turned over, including Demosthenes. A pro-Macedonian Athenian met Alexander outside the city, and Alexander let himself be talked into giving them all just one more pass, into specifically sparing the life of Demosthenes. Alexander liked the idea of a public display of his clemency. Like Philip, Alexander seems to have gone out of his way to appease the Athenians. Maybe the Macedonians were a little insecure about how the urbane Athenians perceived them. Or maybe there was a streak of benevolence in both the father and son. Either way, despite being the originator of this latest rebellion against the Macedonians and their new king, Demosthenes got off the hook again. Alexander had work to do. He set to planning the next phase of the invasion of Persia. Starting with Darius I and Xerxes I, for 150 years, the Persians had been making periodic forays into Greek territory. And while the Greeks were usually able to put aside their petty squabbling long enough to chase the Persians out of Greece, it was time to put a stop for this once and for all. Besides, turning the tables on and besting Persia would vault a commander to the top of the Greeks' all-time great list. What's more, the Ionian Greek cities on the west coast of Asia Minor had never wanted to fall under the sway of the King of Kings, dating all the way back to their absorption into Persia following Cyrus's defeat of the obscenely rich Lydian king Croesus. If you haven't listened to the Cyrus episodes yet, you should! In planning his invasion of Persia, Alexander would pick up where Philip left off. He planned to implement the next phase of the war, mount Bucephalus, his majestic warhorse, and go out a-conquerin'. The ambitious young king had a destiny to fulfill, and in case he got any ideas about staying home and letting his generals fight for him, his mother, Olympias, constantly reminded him he was descended from the gods. She filled his head with visions of greatness and goaded him into becoming the legend he was meant to be. Off he went. Back in Athens, Demosthenes finally acknowledged the legitimacy of the Macedonians and the wisdom of their young king. Oh, just kidding. Once Alexander left town, Demosthenes, who just couldn't let it go, kept trashing Alexander, the same guy that just spared his life, calling him foolish, calling him useless, calling him an ignorant little boy. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of tired of this guy. Fortunately for me, and if you agree, then for you as well, Demosthenes exits the story of Alexander. He has about a decade left to live, and he will face charges of bribery and corruption and further rises and falls in Athenian politics, exile, and suicide by poisoning in 322 BCE. As events would unfold, Demosthenes would outlive Alexander by about a year, but, just like with the death of Philip II, the resulting change in Macedonian leadership would not change anything about the political landscape in Greece. The Macedonians are here to stay for a while, and Demosthenes would never realize his project of tossing aside the barbarous Macedonians and restoring Athens to its rightful place as king of the Greek hill again. This is a good time to pause the story. Alexander has taken over from his fallen father, and by bloody purges and efficient and ruthless military campaigning, has eliminated any internal or external threats to his rule. He's ready to go to Persia and to fulfill his destiny. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we catch up with Alexander. Having taken care of business close to home, he's about to embark on the most ambitious campaign of conquest the world had ever known.